The last 3 nannies at Blackwood Manor vanished without a trace. Tonight, I discovered why. Hidden inside the nursery wall was a diary filled with names, dates, and deaths. The final entry was dated tomorrow. It had my name on it. The wind doesn't just blow through Blackwood Manor. It breathes. The mansion of echoes. The wind doesn't just blow through Blackwood Manor. It breathes. It's a cold, rattling respiration that seeps through the floorboards and shivers against the back of your neck. Most people would call it a draft. Most people would say an estate built in 1920 is bound to have its quirks. But I've been the nanny here for 6 months. And I know better. This house is holding its breath. It's waiting for something, or maybe, it's waiting for me to finally notice what's right in front of my face. My employer, Julian Vance, is the kind of man who commands silence without ever raising his voice. He is a titan of the tech industry, a widower with a gaze like fractured ice and a smile that never quite reaches his eyes. He pays me 3 times the market rate to look after his 5-year-old son, Leo, but the money comes with a price. The price is discretion. The price is never asking why the 3rd floor is locked. The price is ignoring the way the previous nannies seem to vanish into thin air. Their names never mentioned, their belongings never left behind. The hidden crevice. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of gray, drizzly afternoon where the fog rolls off the coast and swallows the driveway whole. Leo was napping. Julian was in the city for a board meeting. I was dusting the nursery, a room that always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the house. I moved the heavy oak dresser to reach a cobweb, and that's when I saw it. A hairline fracture in the wood paneling. A seam that didn't align with the rest of the wall. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I shouldn't have touched it. I should have walked away and finished my chores. But curiosity is a poison, and I had already taken a long drink. I pressed my fingers against the seam. There was a faint click. A small, rectangular section of the wall popped forward, revealing a hollow space no larger than a cigar box. Inside, wrapped in stained velvet, lay a leather-bound book. It wasn't an antique. It was modern. It was Julian's handwriting. Words written in blood. I opened the first page, expecting business notes or perhaps a private grief for his late wife. Instead, I found a ledger. But Julian wasn't tracking stocks or revenue. He was tracking heartbeats. April 12th. Elena. She noticed the basement door was unlocked. A pity. She had such a lovely laugh. The transition was quick. The garden is blooming beautifully this year. My breath hitched. Elena. That was the nanny before me. The agency told me she had moved back to Italy to care for her mother. I turned the page, my hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. November 19th. Sarah, too curious for her own good. She found the locket in the study. I told her it was a family heirloom. She didn't believe me. The collection grows. Her eyes were the exact shade of the sea before a storm. I wasn't reading a diary. I was reading a trophy room. I was reading a map of the bodies buried beneath the manicured lawn of Blackwood Manor. And then, I saw the final entry. The ink was still fresh. The date marked for tomorrow. May 15th. Clara, that's my name. The cold realization. I stared at my name on the page until the letters blurred into a jagged black smear. My name wasn't just a label, it was a deadline. In Julian's precise, elegant script, he had already narrativized my end before it even happened. I realized then that the drafts I felt in the house weren't air currents. They were the physical sensation of being watched, the weight of a predator's gaze measuring the distance to its prey. Every kind gesture Julian had shown me, every bonus on my paycheck, and every glass of wine he had poured for me after a long day with Leo, it wasn't generosity. It was the fattening of the calf. I looked at the nursery door. It was closed, but the heavy wood offered no sense of security. Beyond that door lay a house that was no longer a home or a workplace, but a meticulously designed trap. I thought of Leo, sleeping soundly in the crib just a few feet away. Did he know? How could a child grow up in a house built on such silence? Or perhaps, that was the point. Julian wasn't just collecting wives or nannies, he was curated a world where no one survived long enough to tell him no. The sound of the engine. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floorboards. My stomach dropped. It was the sound of a high-end European engine, Julian's car. He was supposed to be in the city for another 4 hours. The fog must have cancelled his meetings. Or perhaps he had a sixth sense for when his secrets were being disturbed. I scrambled to put the diary back. My fingers were slick with sweat. Making the leather slip, I forced the book into the velvet wrap, shoved it into the hollow, and pressed the panel back into place. Click. The sound felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. I lunged for the oak dresser, straining every muscle in my back to shove it back over the seam. It groaned against the floor. Every inch felt like a mile, just as the dresser legs settled into their original indentations in the rug. I heard the heavy thud of the front door downstairs. The hunter returns. Clara? His voice floated up the grand staircase. It was calm, too calm. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly where everything in his house was supposed to be. I grabbed a discarded teddy bear from the floor and sat on the rocking chair next to Leo's crib. My heart hammering so loudly I was certain he would hear it from the hallway. I forced my breathing to slow. I picked up a book, a children's story about a lost rabbit, and pretended to read. Even though my eyes couldn't focus on a single word. The footsteps approached. They weren't hurried. Julian Vance never hurried. He walked with the rhythmic, predatory grace of a man who owned the ground he stood on. The door handle turned slowly. The hinges didn't creak. Julian kept them well oiled. He stood in the doorway, his charcoal suit still perfectly pressed despite the damp weather outside. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at me. His eyes swept the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on the oak dresser. A game of cat and mouse. "You're home early, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. I didn't look up from the book immediately, playing the part of the dedicated employee. "The city was stifling," he replied, stepping into the room. The air seemed to vanish as he approached. And I found myself worried about Leo. And you, of course. This house can be quite lonely when the fog rolls in. He walked over to the dresser. My lungs seized. He reached out a hand. His long, slender fingers tracing the wood grain right above the hidden panel. I watched the gold of his wedding ring, the one he still wore for a wife he had likely murdered, glint in the dim afternoon light. "Is everything all right in here, Clara? You look flushed." "Just a bit of cleaning," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "Moving furniture to get the dust. This old house gathers it so quickly." Julian smiled. It was the smile from the diary, the one that never reached his ice-cold eyes. "Yes, it does. But some things are better left undisturbed. Don't you think? Dust has a way of settling for a reason." The first move. He didn't leave the room. Instead, he pulled a chair from the corner and sat down across from me. He watched me for an hour as I watched the sleeping child. It was a psychological war. He wanted to see if I would crack. He wanted to see if the prey knew it was in the crosshairs. Every time I shifted, his eyes followed the movement. Every time I glanced at the window, he smiled a little wider. I realized I couldn't just run. The gates were electronic. The perimeter was patrolled by a security firm he owned. The phones were likely tapped. If I was going to survive May 15th, I couldn't be a victim. I had to become a player in his game. I had to use the one thing the diary proved he possessed, his ego. Planning the escape. When he finally retreated to his study, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I went to my small room in the servants' wing and began to take notes. Not on paper, he would find that. I took notes in my mind. I knew his schedule. I knew the security codes for the kitchen entrance. And I knew, from the diary, that he liked his victims to be surprised. He enjoyed the moment the realization hit their faces. That was his weakness. He would wait until the very last moment to strike because the anticipation was his greatest high. I had 24 hours. Tomorrow was May 15th, the day Julian Vance planned to add a new chapter to his ledger. But as I stared out at the fog-shrouded garden where Elena and Sarah supposedly bloomed, I made a silent vow. I wasn't going to be a memory in a leather-bound book. I was going to be the one who closed it for good. The midnight preparation. The clock in the hallway struck 12. May 15th had officially arrived. I sat on the edge of my bed, the room pitch black, listening to the house settle. In Blackwood Manor, silence isn't the absence of sound, it's a presence. It's the sound of Julian's influence suffocating every corner. I had spent the last 4 hours mentally dismantling the security system. I knew the cameras in the hallway went into a blind spot for exactly 40 seconds during their sweep. I knew the digital lock on the side door had a manual override intended for fire emergencies, a small physical lever hidden behind a painting of a landscape that looked remarkably like a graveyard. I didn't pack a bag. A bag meant I was leaving. A bag was a confession. Instead, I wore layers. I tucked my passport, a small roll of cash I'd hidden under the floorboards weeks ago, and a heavy brass letter opener I'd taken from the library into the waistband of my jeans. It was a pathetic weapon against a man like Julian, but it was the only thing that made the trembling in my hands stop. I wasn't just planning to run, I was planning to survive the transition he had so eloquently described in his ledger. The final walk through. I crept out of my room, moving only when the wind gusted against the windows to mask the creak of the floorboards. I had to see the diary one last time. I needed to know if he had added anything since the afternoon. I needed to see the face of my enemy in his own words. The nursery was bathed in the eerie, blue glow of the moon. Leo was a silhouette in his crib, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. I moved to the dresser. My muscles screamed as I pushed it just far enough to reach the panel. My fingers found the seam, and the wall opened. The book was there. I flipped to the last page. May 15th, 12:05 a.m. Clara is awake. I can hear her heart beating through the vents. She thinks she is a shadow, but she is a flare in the dark. The anticipation is almost better than the act. I wonder if she'll scream like Sarah, or if she'll be silent like the house. The book fell from my hands. He wasn't in his study. He wasn't asleep. He was listening. The shadow in the hallway. I didn't bother closing the panel. I didn't bother moving the dresser. The game was over, and the hunt had begun. I bolted for the door, my socks sliding on the polished hardwood. I hit the hallway just as a door at the far end opened. Julian stood there. He wasn't wearing his suit anymore. He was in a dark silk robe, holding a glass of amber liquid. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man watching a favorite movie for the 100th time. "It's a bit late for a stroll, Clara," he said. His voice didn't carry anger. It carried a terrifying, paternal disappointment. "I told you, some things are better left undisturbed. Now you've gone and ruined the surprise." I didn't answer. I turned and ran toward the back staircase. I knew the house better than he thought. I had spent my afternoons exploring every inch while Leo napped. I knew the service elevator was out of commission, but the laundry chute dropped straight into the basement. It was a 20-foot drop into a pile of linens. It was a risk, but Julian was already moving toward me, his pace quickening, his eyes fixed on mine with a predatory hunger. The descent. I reached the laundry room and wrenched open the metal flap. The darkness inside was absolute. I could hear Julian's footsteps, heavy, deliberate thuds on the stairs. He was laughing, a low, soft chuckle that made my skin crawl. "There's nowhere to go, Clara. The gates are locked. The guards are mine. You're just a character in a story that's already been written." I didn't wait for him to reach the door. I climbed into the chute and let go. The world turned into a blur of cold metal and rushing air. I hit the bottom with a force that knocked the wind out of my lungs. Buried under a mountain of dirty sheets and towels, I lay there for a second, gasping, my ribs aching. Above me, I heard the metal flap of the chute bang shut. I scrambled out of the bin. The basement was a labyrinth of stone pillars and humming furnaces. It smelled of damp earth and old copper. This was where he brought them. This was the garden he had mentioned. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dim emergency lights. In the far corner, tucked behind a water heater, was a heavy steel door. It didn't lead outside, it led further down. The chamber of echoes. The steel door groaned as I pulled it open, the sound echoing through the cavernous basement like a dying gasp. I expected a cellar, a dungeon, or perhaps a furnace room. Instead, I stepped into a pristine, white-tiled laboratory. It was blindingly bright, lit by recessed LED strips that made the stainless steel tables glisten with a sterile, terrifying beauty. There were no bloodstains, no chains, no signs of a struggle. Julian Vance didn't do messy. He did clinical. Against the far wall stood a row of glass cylinders, each filled with a clear, viscous fluid. Inside them, suspended like specimens in a museum, were the belongings of the women who came before me. Alina's red silk scarf, Sarah's gold locket, a pair of ballet slippers, a wedding ring. They weren't just trophies, they were organized, catalogued, and preserved. I realized then that Julian didn't just want to kill us, he wanted to stop time. He wanted to own our essence, frozen forever at the moment of his choosing. The sound of the descent. The heavy thud of the basement door upstairs sent a jolt of adrenaline through my limbs. Julian was down. I could hear the rhythmic clack 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 of his leather shoes on the stone stairs. He wasn't running. Why would he run when he knew every exit was sealed? He was whistling, a soft, melodic tune that I recognized as a lullaby he often hummed to Leo. I looked around the lab frantically. There was no other door. The only way out was back past him, or through a small ventilation duct near the ceiling. I grabbed a rolling medical stool and shoved it under the vent. It was high, too high for a clean jump. I climbed onto a steel table, my breath coming in ragged hitches. The metal was ice cold against my palms. Clara, his voice echoed. Closer now. You've found the gallery. I usually wait until the very end to show my guests this room. You should be honored. You've bypassed the narrative structure entirely. A fragile weapon. I reached for the vent cover, my fingers catching on the sharp metal edges. I pulled with everything I had, the screws screaming as they gave way. Just as the cover clattered to the floor, Julian stepped into the laboratory. He looked at me, perched on the table like a trapped animal, and let out a short, bark-like laugh. The ventilation system leads to the generator room. Clara, it's a dead end with a very loud engine. But please, don't let me stop you. The struggle is what gives the memory its texture. He set his amber glass down on a nearby counter and began to put on a pair of white latex gloves. The snap of the rubber against his wrists sounded like a death knell. I looked down at the table I was standing on. Next to my foot was a tray of surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, and a heavy, glass-stoppered bottle labeled sevoflurane. The counterattack. I didn't climb into the vent. I realized he expected me to crawl into a hole where he could easily trap me. Instead, I grabbed the heavy glass bottle. I'm not going in the jar. Julian, I said, my voice cracking but loud. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on me with a terrifying, blank intensity. The jar is for the things that last. Clara, you're overthinking it. It's a transition, like a sunset. As he lunged for my ankles to pull me off the table, I swung the bottle of anesthetic with all my might against the corner of the steel table. The glass shattered, spraying the pungent, sweet-smelling liquid everywhere. The fumes hit us both instantly. Julian stumbled, his gloved hand catching the edge of the table. He coughed, his eyes widening as he realized what I'd done. The fog of war. I covered my nose with my sleeve. But the world was already beginning to tilt. The bright white lights of the lab started to spin into long, dizzying streaks of silver. Julian was on his knees now, shaking his head like a dazed bull. He reached for me, his fingers brushing the fabric of my jeans. But his grip was weak. I scrambled off the other side of the table, my legs feeling like lead. I had to get out before the gas claimed me too. I stumbled toward the door, my vision tunneling. I could hear Julian's heavy, labored breathing behind me, a wet, rasping sound. You ruined the ending, he hissed, his voice slurring. I didn't look back. I hit the stone stairs of the basement, crawling more than climbing. Every step was a battle against the crushing weight of sleep. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut. Turning the heavy iron bolt, I heard a dull thud from below. Silence followed. The escape. I made it to the hallway, the cool air of the house helping to clear the fog from my brain. I didn't head for the gates. I knew the security guards would be there. Instead, I headed for the one place Julian wouldn't expect, his own study. I knew he kept a set of master keys in the top drawer of his desk, the key to the kingdom. He had joked once, "I found them," my fingers fumbling with the heavy brass ring. I also found something else. A burner phone, already powered on, with a single contact listed, the cleaner. I took the phone and the keys. I ran to the garage, bypassing the luxury sedans and heading straight for the old SUV the estate used for hauling supplies. The gates opened with the master remote. As I sped down the long, winding driveway of Blackwood Manor, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house stood tall and dark against the moon, a monument to a man who thought he could right the world. I wasn't a character in his story anymore. I was the one holding the pen, and I was driving straight to the police station with a leather-bound diary and a phone that proved he didn't act alone.
In a house built on silence, the loudest thing you can find is a secret that refuses to stay buried.